Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to yet more Warhammer 40k lore, where we're going to have a look at yet another Imperial Guard regiment. Today, the Pyran dragoons. A regiment interesting not because of what they do, but because of what they are. And what they are snooty-assed cunts. Perfect. Oh, and by the way, this is, as far as I know, the only piece of artwork in existence for this regiment, so, as you can probably imagine, the video will be somewhat light on the artwork. But as you may already be able to tell from the one piece we have, their look is inspired by the British Royal Horse Guards, the Blues and the Royals. Mind you, the 1969 and onwards version, in which the Royal Horse Guards were joined with the 1st Dragoons, since of course their look is that of the Royal Horse Guards with the blue uniforms, but their name is of course the Pyran dragoons, thereby the 1st Dragoons of the British Royal Army. But enough about that, back to the 40k version. The Pyran dragoons, of course, hail from the world of Pyran, located in the Armageddon subsector of the Segmentum Solar, the very same Armageddon subsector that has been the favourite chewy squeaky toy of a certain orc warlord. There were even 10 regiments of dragoons on Armageddon during the orc invasion, although their contribution was somewhat limited due to the nature of their deployment. A rather considerable section of them were sent into the equatorial jungle to be trained under the famous Armageddon Orc Hunters, which has got to be the absolute single worst usage of Pyran dragoons I could ever possibly come up with. Hey, you know what? Let's put this regiment of stuck-up Imperial noble sons with a bunch of filthy, downright dirty orc hunters that will do anything and everything to get the job done. I am sure they will get along famously. On the other hand, though, they must have done something right, since they were complimented by Commissar Sebastian Jarek himself, who stated that by the Emperor these men do war honor, when commenting on the Pyran dragoons after the battle for Helltown, which is interesting because, if my memory serves, the Pyran dragoons essentially abandoned Helltown to the orcs and left the Armageddon orc hunters to get their asses pounded in for a considerable amount of time before they could finally push the greenskins back out of Helltown. Now, to be fair, the War for Armageddon was one of those really old sourcebooks, so there might be some confusion between the really old canon and the not quite as ridiculously old canon that I'm unaware of. And again, to be fair, he could simply just have been commenting on their stylish sense of dress. But anyways, the version of the story that I have heard is that the Pyran dragoons, a regiment of them, were sent off to be taught how to hunt orcs. Unsurprisingly for anyone who isn't an administratum drone, the noble haughty Pyran dragoons viewed the dirty, filthy, camouflage-wearing cowards of the Armageddon orc hunters with naught but distaste and disdain. As such, they had a less than entirely positive relationship with their new teachers. And to be honest, I kind of sympathize with the dragoons here. They are a cavalry/mechanized shock troop regiment being deployed in the fucking jungle, where they may not use their cavalry, for which they are rightly famed, or their mechanized formation to any real effect, and their fabulously dressed and superbly drilled infantry will have to wander through a goddamn jungle where they can't use so much as a single fucking gram of their precious unit discipline. Truly and honestly, it is a God-Emperor-given talent to misuse men to this degree, and the Adeptus Administratum most certainly are the proud owners of said ability. Anyways, now that the Pyran dragoons were stuck in the goddamn jungle, they did not get along particularly well with their new teachers. Their teachers realized this fact and understood that they would probably never be able to drag these haughty-ass gentlemen down from their genetically enhanced mounts and into the mud. As such, they decided to simply plonk them down on perimeter defense duty, figuring that at the very least there, when they could keep their shiny little boots polished and clean, they might at least serve as some form of roadblock to any incoming orc invasion. The only problem was that the Pyran dragoons did not feel that being mere roadblocks was fitting of their pedigree, and so as soon as the orcs showed up in any real numbers, the dragoons simply elected to utilize their superior mobility to relocate to a more strategically suitable position from which to provide future aid in the case of hostile actions taken on other portions of the line. Or, in plain English, they got the fuck out of the way and let the orcs into the camp. This overriding tactical decision of course left the occupants of said camp, the Armageddon Orc Hunters, in a wee bit of a pickle, and it took them a great deal of effort and considerable loss in life for them to unpickle themselves. Now, in my honest, highborn opinion, the Armageddon Orc Hunters are named the Orc Hunters. They should, if anything, be grateful that their betters simply allowed them to carry out their orc hunting on their home turf, thereby clearly giving them the advantage. And whilst it would normally be considered uncouth for those of superior breeding to trumpet their own achievements too much, but since one has to explain the finer points of warfare to low-born jungle savages, one may very well point out that the strategic relocation of the dragoons achieved the result of luring the barbaric orcs deep into the prepared ground oft referred to as our home base, where they were engaged swiftly by the equally savage densians of said locale. The most noble dragoons could then, after a sufficiently restorative period of time had passed, it is after all ever so tiring to move about in sweltering jungles, move in to cut off the greenskins' escape and execute a perfectly planned encirclement. Or at the very least, I imagine something along those lines would be the post-fact explanation for why Colonel Tanley Drake of the Pyran dragoons decided to strategically relocate his regiment just as the orcs arrived. Unfortunately, he was attempting to make this case to a somewhat peeved-off Colonel Pertinax, commander of the base's Armageddon Orc Hunters, who did not see the strategic necessity in his perimeter guard simply fucking off out of the way of an incoming orc invasion force. The two of them had a heated bit of discourse before Colonel Tanley Drake, fully within his noble rights of course, challenged Colonel Pertinax to an honourable duel to settle this dispute. The Honourable Colonel draw first blood on the savage, therefore winning the duel. The fact that Colonel Pertinax was then subsequently found astride the Honourable Colonel, repeatedly punching him in the face until he stopped moving, was considered a considerably less important part of the engagement by the noble dragoons, who subsequently disengaged from the battlefield with honour and withdrew to Inferno's Hive. Now clearly, that is a less than stellar entry into the Pyran dragoons' noble history, but not to fear, they're not completely useless. In fact, most of the time, they're fairly effective troops. Their homeworld is relatively rich and relatively well industrialized, meaning that the majority of their regiments can fight as mounted and mechanized troops. Of course, the officers primarily come from the noble classes, because obviously, whilst the ground-pounding infantry come from the various noble houses, and either serve in the various dragoon regiments as mere mounted infantry, or of course in armoured fist platoons, mounted in APCs. The dragoons are extraordinarily disciplined, and they have a near supernatural belief in their betters. Every last single member of the infantry forces have been raised from their very first day on the planet to believe that their nobles knows what's best, and that they couldn't possibly have any idea worth even so much as mentioning that the nobles haven't already thought of. Whether or not this is entirely correct, well, that's a different matter. But you cannot deny just how valuable it is to have infantry forces entirely and completely convinced that their commanders can do absolutely no wrong, no matter how ridiculous their current situation may appear. And this unflinching belief in their own leadership, along with their own supreme discipline, is of vital importance to a formation like the Dragoons. They enjoy fighting in rigid formations, delivering organized and timed volleys of lasgun fire to the enemy. They enjoy moving rapidly in organized platoons of APCs, coordinating the fire with their infantry forces along with their mechanized troops, any supporting units, and of course chargers from their noble cavalry troops. The Pyran dragoons view war as an art form, The troops on the ground are not but chess pieces to be maneuvered into the perfect position to strike. When done correctly, it has absolutely devastating effect upon the enemy. When done incorrectly, well, let's just say that tightly packed formations of troops in parade ground order make rather excellent targets for heavy machine guns. Now certainly, the Dragoons' way of war, it would not be universally effective. It would fare exceptionally poorly against enemies like the Eldar, who would be able to outmaneuver them quite drastically, and would also in all due likelihood be way better at coordinating the forces, or against the Tau, which would easily be able to outgun them to a frankly hilarious degree. But against the right enemy, say for example an Orcish horde, which even at the best of times have some challenges in pointing their weapons in anything except the vague general direction of their enemy, and consider the words organization, timing, and cooperations to be the most vile of curse words, against that kind of opponents, the Dragoons' way of war will work just fine. They also make excellent policing forces, as the inherent superiority of the noble classes means that they will happily crack down upon any local population without even the slightest, most minuscule hint of guilt or hesitance. And equally so, the men under their command, once again, are entirely convinced that their nobles do best, and they also consider themselves, being from noble houses, to be quite superior to the regular riffraff of the Imperium, and will also not feel any form of guilt about beating down their fellow citizens. There is, however, a little bit of a problem with this sense of superiority. It means that the Dragoons consider themselves to be above all others, which could potentially be of beneficial usage if employed correctly against certain rowdy population centers, but it also makes any form of cooperation with any other Imperial forces somewhat strained. And whilst honor duels are technically illegal, but of course, as long as nobody finds out, I mean, is it really a crime if nobody ever knows about it? The Dragoons would say, no, it isn't. And in the overwhelming majority of cases, these honor duels are only fought until first blood. Only the most egregious of insults, like stepping on somebody's favored boots, for example, would require an actual fight to the death. And so, the honourable nature of it, as well as of course the expediency, means that honor duels is most definitively the premier way that Dragoon officers resolve their differences. And seeing as this is obviously the noble and correct way of resolving a dispute, it is also how they tend to fix their disagreements with other Imperial Guard forces, many of which have different understandings of what exactly constitutes honourable combat, as so thoroughly demonstrated by the commander of the Armageddon Orc Hunters utilising the commander of the Pyran dragoons' face as a canvas for his own interpretation of honourable combat. But, of course, savages will be savages. There is simply nothing one can do about the lesser classes in society getting all rowdy and uncontrollable, except for giving them a good old-fashioned bap to the back of the head with a rifle butt, of course. And it is so clearly, so indisputably the fact that the Pyran way of doing things is superior. Their caste-based system is obviously the best way to run a society. Just look how nice and organized it is. The higher noble classes rule the various houses. The various houses then have large numbers of essentially servants, which make up the various foot troops and other servile classes of Pyran society. And make no mistake, this is of course a honest-to-God meritocracy. Anyone, absolutely anyone, could become an officer and therefore a noble in the Dragoons. Obviously, you could also buy your commission, but we don't speak of that. Those are mere details. That does not preclude any normal filth citizens from becoming officers. It simply means that those who have already obtained a meritorious position within society, e.g. being filthy stinking rich, have first shot at these positions. And then, of course, there is the constant power struggles on the homeworld itself. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of various noble houses with varying degrees of influence upon the noble society. Of course, at the absolute top is the Imperial planetary governor and his immediate family, divided into several sub-houses. Then there is the local nobles. Then there are descendants of the planet's founders. You see, Pyran has a long and proud history as being the only planet within the Armageddon subsector that was settled by its imperial population via right of conquest. Now, if you are not aware, a right of conquest is granted to an Imperial Guard regiment when they make a contribution to a single battlefront that is considered so crucial, so decisive, that if it was not for this action, and for the presence of this Guard regiment, the battle would surely have been lost. In these cases, the Guard regiment might declare a right of conquest, where the regiment will be allowed to settle and gain ownership of the world that they, through their contribution, essentially conquered. This is by a country mile the greatest honor that can possibly be bestowed upon an Imperial Guard regiment. And it was this precise honor that was awarded to the Tyler Grenadiers in the 34th millennium, where their actions destroyed a large chaos-raiding force, thereby liberating and conquering the world that is today known as Pyran. The commander of the Grenadiers was elevated to the status of Imperial Governor, and his various officers became the scions of the greatest noble houses on Pyran today. Oh, most of them, anyways. Said competition between the houses have seen some of them fall into ignominy, but again, we don't talk about that. And of course, being the descendants of such a illustrious regiment with such a long and proud history, being awarded the greatest possible honor, the people of the planet are of course quite proud of their history. And make no mistake, this pride infuses every single level of society. Even the lowest members of the social orders are quite content with their lot, or at least that's what they'll tell you, and are more than happy to serve their great and noble houses. And again, the planet is of course a complete meritocracy. If an individual guardsman were to provide certain vital services to the regiment, then just as in the history of their illustrious founding fathers, he may be raised up on the battlefield to the status of a noble. This would grant a huge boon to his noble house, of course, but it might also leave some of the other already established nobles in the regiment feeling mildly put out, mildly disrespected, perhaps even a tiny bit miffed, and they might occasionally, due to a wee bit of petulance here and there, do certain things to make the newly elevated officer's life a living hell, basically. Excluding him from tactical briefings, for example, making sure that his troops are always supplied last, making sure that they're always shafted when it comes to maintenance of their weapons and vehicles, and so on and so on and so on. It tends to be the case that the newly elevated officer encounters some form of mishap in his first few engagements, often involving an unfortunate discharge of a friendly las gun to the back of his head. These things happen during warfare, and now that he had this mishap, there's no further reason to inconvenience his regiments. They are, after all, mourning the loss of their commander. As such, they should now be rewarded with a few goodies here and there, because they are, of course, in mourning, you know how it works. It's entirely fair and natural. So don't let anyone ever tell you that this is not a meritocratic society, because that would be a damnable lie. Oh yes, indeed, sir. And hey, his noble house still enjoys a massive boost to reputation, so win-win in all due reality. Everybody comes out as winners. Except possibly for that one loser. But again, details. Details, insignificant and inconsequential details. So as you can clearly see, the Pyran dragoons are one of the finest regiments in the God Emperor's service. It is a damn shame that no other Imperial regiment can measure up to their illustrious career, and it's also a damn shame that they simply can't seem to recognize that fact, but, as always, It is the sign of true nobility to soldier on even in the face of the brutish ignorance of others. And on that note, shilling time. If you liked this video, please consider leaving a like and sharing it around. YouTube's algorithms are getting more and more fascinating every day, and it really does help the channel a lot. Now then, until next time, I have been Arch, thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.